What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the show. Today we have a Q&A episode, so thank you to everybody who asked a question. We're doing this one the early morning here. I got this weird ghost lighting. Looks like I'm telling ghost stories or something like that, but it is what it is. When we put the background light on, it just doesn't look really good. And so thank you to everybody who asked a question. I'm going to go through as many of these as I can in a reasonable amount of time. Pending how many tangents I go on, maybe we can get through all of them. Geez, that is doubtful, but I'm hopeful. So we'll see. First question, I won't read names. Any resources for training and nutrition in pregnancy? Absolutely. Brianna Battles, I think her Instagram is @brianna.battles, would be my resource. That's somebody that's been my go-to for questions that I have and resources along the way. She was also on my podcast. I've also been on her podcast. She's wonderful. Really, really good wealth of knowledge and has a lot of good resources, offers coaching, all of that good stuff as well. I'll link the podcast with her in the description, and I'll put her Instagram in there as well. Next question. Female, 30% body fat. Goals are fat loss and muscle gain. Not at the same time, of course, which, by the way, could be possible. 3 years or more lifting. How would you recommend to periodize the next year or two? And I remember I reached out and I asked you if you meant more of a nutrition side of things or from a training side of things. From a training side of things, the question would have been different. It would have been a lot of, I don't think that periodization, it depends what the goal is. Let's say if it was hypertrophy, then I don't think much, if any, periodization is necessary or even beneficial outside of potential fun. From a nutrition standpoint, I have a lot of questions. And I think that's the tough part here. The question is how lean does this person want to get? They're 30% body fat. That's not an alarming in any way, body size or body fatness to me. And so I'm not I don't know where this person wants to go from here. If this person wants to get to 25% body fat or so, you might be able to just do that in one shot, right? You may be able to do that in one concise deficit. And the method in which you go about setting up the length of your deficit, the expectations of your deficit, the size and rate of fat loss that you'd like is very personal. I'm not even sure that we should be setting hard timelines. A lot of people set a timeline, get in, get out like that. And I've even said that. I totally have been in a place where that's been something I've recommended. But I'm not so sure. If we're really if this is more somebody who's hey, I'd really like to lose some weight and keep it off forever. And this is a once in a, something I want to do once. This isn't part of my cyclical dieting of bulking and cutting and bulking and cutting. And, I'm not doing this for fun and fitness. I'm doing this for health. Then I would look at it a little bit differently. And I would look at it with less of a timeline, more of a, this is fucking forever sort of thing. And I need to make sure that, I'm taking care of my mental health and relationship with food along the way, and that I'm not doing anything that I can't see myself, doing forever, at least in some regard. And so I would actually have a lot of follow-up questions. I actually think the periodization of nutrition is, to me, I don't want to use diet culture or fit culture, but that is not necessarily something that applies to the I want to get healthy and stay healthy crowd, which is 99.999% of the population. I don't think we need to be hey, 8 weeks of maintenance, 3-week reverse, 12-week 8-week deficit, 3-week reverse, 12-week maintenance, and then 8-week this, and we need to plan out the next 2 years with this exact where we're going to be and titrating calories through different phases. To me, having worked with enough of these I want to get healthy and stay healthy people, which by the way is where that is most of the people in the world, and if we're trying to do the most good, I really want to make sure we're helping those people. That I don't know that we need to be doing this. I'm not so sure we need to be thinking about planning out the next 2 years. I think we need to be focusing on, this person's relationship with food, building good habits, new foundational behaviors that will aid in their ability to sustain whatever changes they make. If this is a person who's again, you said 30% body fat. I don't know if that's hey, I just finished a bulk and that's where I'm at, and I want to do a bit more of the cyclical dieting because I'm looking for long-term body recomposition changes. I'm not worried about letting myself get to an unhealthy body fat range or anything like that. This is all totally autonomous, something that I can do on my own, and that would be a different story. And still, even if that were the case, it's still very personal. How how aggressive does this person enjoy cutting? How aggressive does this person enjoy bulking? Are there timelines that this person needs to, like external things that this person needs to adhere to? Are they like, hey, I really don't want to be like peak bulk weight over the summer, and I have this wedding over here, I don't want to be peak bulk weight, and so I'm not necessarily sure. I have a lot of questions. If this is a person that's like, I want to get healthy and stay healthy, then I don't think a lot of this periodization is not just necessary, it's just not what I would do. I'd be focused way more on this person's behaviors and their headspace, relationship with food, in their environment, the people around them, support systems, like resetting, just like the way they think about food and exercise and building good foundational habits. Like that to me is way more important than taking out a calendar and trying to map out the next 2 years. That's more of like a bodybuilder style mentality, who's like voluntarily doing cyclical dieting for a net body recomposition improvement over time, which is fine. That in that context that makes sense to me. So I would want to know more. That's all. Next question: is carb cycling actually an effective way to lose fat? I see it promoted all over IG. Yeah, good question. Really simple answer. There's literally zero benefit of carb cycling over not carb cycling if calories and protein are equated. And so this idea that there's a benefit to having higher and lower carb days inherently outside of just calories and protein is untrue. So totally not true. If you are eating 2,000 calories and you are eating, let's say, the same macros every day, for example, whether you're tracking them or not, or you're like eating the same calories and protein on average, but some days are high carb, some days are low carb, it's literally irrelevant. Most of the time, carb cycling is just a way, like a repackaged way of calorie cycling. And so carb cycling typically means like on my higher carb days, that means I'm having higher calories. And on my lower carb days, it means I'm having lower calories. That also is not inherently better. If you average out the calories, it's going to be exactly the same thing. And so if you have 2,000 calories on one day and 2,400 calories on another day, it's the same as averaging 2,200 calories, like regardless of how you're splitting that up. If calories and protein are equated, you're gonna see the same results. That is why I recommend actually just counting calories and protein in almost all contexts. I've actually been doing this for a long time and just have never had somebody who was counting the macros switch to calories and protein and not think that it was the most amazing thing ever, like quality of life enhancing strategy. So yeah, that's my opinion on that. Next question? What's the purpose of looking at data on a macro cycle? I'm going to take a couple liberties here. I don't necessarily know exactly what you're referring to, but if you're talking about a macro cycle, which is like a string of mesocycles. So people are always like, Jordan, what's a mesocycle? Well, when we talk about these words like micro and meso and macro, they're just referring to an amount of time, generally. And so when we look at a microcycle is like it is typically about 1 week, but really what a microcycle means is one round of your workouts. So if you're training 4 days a week, it's one round of those 4 workouts, which typically we pair with the calendar week. And so a microcycle is usually a week. I have some friends who train like not in synchronization with the weekly calendar. They're doing like 5 workouts over 9 days. And so for them, their microcycle is a 9-day microcycle. And they might do 6 microcycles in their mesocycle. Typically, we can talk about this in terms of weeks because most people are doing this within the calendar week, but not everybody. And so I will talk about it in terms of weeks. A microcycle is 1 week. A mesocycle is X number of microcycles. So maybe 6 to 8, right? 4 to 8 microcycles. Is a mesocycle, which is basically like the time in between deloads. And so a mesocycle is a string of microcycles in between or bookended by deloads. And a macrocycle would be anywhere from like 3 to 5 mesocycles strung together where you might have even more of a concise goal. And so you might have a macrocycle where you're specializing glutes and delts, and that might be like 3 to 5 mesocycles where that's the thing you're focused on. And that is a macrocycle. You're stringing together mesocycles. Stages of learning pull-up. What are some ways to go about beginning that goal? So we were talking about strength to weight ratio as the first thing I would just at least understand is that this is a strength to weight ratio exercise, and just at least acknowledge that that is part of it. You can't just gain strength, and it's just going to be difficult to do pull-ups if you don't at least recognize that there are 2 sides to this equation. You need to be strong, but you also need to be strong per pound that you weigh. Number 2 is you just need to get a really freaking strong back. A lot of people are like, oh, how do I do my first pull-up? I have to do all these pull-ups. I got to grease the groove and I got to do all this like pull-up practice. And we'll get to that in a second. But first and foremost, you need to get a really fucking strong back, period. And so if you look at your program and you're like, there are no pull-ups here, I must not be working on my pull-ups. Like, that's not true. If you're doing a lot of rows and vertical pulling and training the muscles in the back, your biceps, forearms, you are working on pull-ups. And I say that because that'll happen in my group sometimes. People are like, I really want to work on pull-ups. I'm like, yo, you guys are doing a ton of back work. And if you want to work on pull-ups, then get your back, 50% stronger on all of your movements than it is right now. And I promise you, that will translate to your pull-ups. It's like, oh, I really want to get better at whatever. Maybe it's like squatting. It's like, okay, yes, squatting is the best thing you can do to get better at squatting, totally. But all of your leg training will carry over, at least as long as you're doing some form of squatting as well. Like, it's all part of the equation. So number 1 is recognize this is a strength to weight ratio thing. Number 2 is get a strong AF back. Again, that is separate from doing pull-ups. That means you could do pull-ups, but doing pull-downs and rows and lat pull-downs and upper back rows and rear delt rows and like all this stuff, that's all going towards your pull-ups. Those muscles are all important for you to do your first pull-up or more pull-ups or whatever. And number 3 is yes, you need some element of specificity, so you should be practicing the actual movement of doing pull-ups. And so you don't need to obsess over that, in my opinion. Like, it doesn't need to be only, I'm doing eccentric pull-ups on Monday, and then I'm doing banded pull-ups on Wednesday, and then I'm doing dead hangs and stuff and overhead, kind of like isometric holds on Friday. It doesn't need to be so like that. It can be if you want to be, if this is the only goal that you have. But you need to be doing some form of pull-ups, like something specific to the skill of pulling up. Like, neurologically, you want to teach your body how to actually do this technique really well. Yes, if you want to do pull-ups, I recommend having a specific pull-up, either practice or exercise within your program, as many mesocycles or as often as possible. And so if you're in my group, we aren't a push-up specific or a pull-up specific program, but every time I believe that there's an option for you to swap something for pull-ups, I say to you that, hey, if this is, if you're somebody who really wants to work on pull-ups, this is what I would do in this slot. And so the 3 things that you need to do is 1, recognize it's a strength to weight ratio exercise. Number 2 is get a strong AF back, like everywhere on your back, rows on every angle, different arm paths, get a really strong back overall. And number 3 is some form of practicing the movement. And so that could be banded chin-ups, that could be eccentric only chin-ups, that could be dead hangs at the bottom, that could be isometric holds at the top. It could be like super loaded eccentrics where you're loading, even more weight on a belt and controlling the weight down. All of those things can be really great. I'm not a big grease the groove guy where it's like, I gotta practice this every single day. Greasing the groove to me has more benefit for things that are more neurologically complex, like playing a sport, hitting a golf ball, shooting a basketball. You could grease the groove. I just don't think that it's like this massively special thing. I would rather you not grease the groove and actually like recover from your workouts incredibly well and train your back really effing hard, get really effing strong there. And do some form of specific pulling up in your program. Absolutely. I think that is important. I don't want to discount that. Question, why does a mesocycle progress in RIR? Isn't that just making you feel like you're progressing, as you could have hit those weight and reps before, but you're choosing not to? For the first week, can I go to 3 RIR and then just go to 0 or 1 RIR next week's until I stall? Wouldn't that make better gains long-term, more effective reps accumulated? Sorry for the long response. Love your podcast and how honest you are. Thank you. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Let me see if I can simplify it, because I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, why do 3 RIR at the beginning of the mesocycle if a 0 RIR set is more stimulative, right? Which is true. 3 RIR is, you get less hypertrophy at 3 RIR than you do at 0 RIR. So what you said is, so I'm going to use your words here. You said, for the first week, can I go to 3 RIR and then just hit 0 to 1 RIR next week's until I stall? And so what would happen is if you started your mesocycle with 0 to 1 RIR, let me be very clear here. There's a way to organize it where you could do this. And the simple answer is you'd have to do less sets. So you could do 0 RIR right from the get-go, but you wouldn't be able to do as many sets, right? Because if you do a program, let's say my program, where we don't do 0 RIR the entire mesocycle, we start roughly at 2 RIR, let's say. If you do my program, that the intent is to do 2 RIR from the get-go, roughly 3-2-1 on average, about 2. But you do 0 RIR. That means I have accounted for more sets because we're starting a little further from failure than 0. You wouldn't be able to do that many weeks of this, right? So let's say we're doing, I don't know, let's say 12 working sets per day. You wouldn't be able to do 12 sets per workout at 0 to 1 RIR for more than a couple of weeks before I believe you would, depending on the exercise selection and your recovery habits, you might just start to see, at worst, you would overtrain, right? Start to see some joint fatigue, start to see actual performance regression. The reason that I'm not so down on this, I don't think that it's the end of the world. I don't think that most people are at a real risk for overtraining if the program is like 3 or 4 days a week. And so even if you took my program and you said, fuck it, Jordan, I'm doing 0 RIR every single set, the entire mesocycle, I think it's possible that you'd be fine. I think you'd be more likely to come up against joint pain, more likely to come up across overreaching symptoms, maybe poor sleep, fatigue, potentially like illness and stuff like that from a decreased immune system, potentially. But it's possible that you could survive that. I think that this is one of the issues from the effective reps model, though. And so you're saying, hey, I'd get more effective reps if I do this, because why do 3 RIR where I'm only getting roughly 2 effective reps when I could do 0 RIR and I get more like 5 effective reps. Because if you looked across the entire time in which you could train without overtraining, you'd actually get more net effective reps starting at 3 RIR, I believe, and doing a little bit more sets and progressing to 0 RIR. If you actually calculated the effective reps over that time scale, because you'd actually be able to train for longer because you were training with a little bit less intensity from the get-go, I actually think that would net out to more effective reps. I think that's really the point. If you started training at 0 to 1 RIR and you tried to do even remotely higher volumes, you would crash and burn, or you wouldn't be able to do it for as long. So you might get more effective reps per week, per workout, but not per mesocycle. And maybe you'd come up across more joint pain. Now, I am of the opinion of training generally harder, though. I'm not of the opinion that starting at 4 or 5 RIR, it's not. I would rather you spend more of your meso in the 0 to 2 RIR than I think most people in the industry. I'm not trying to I'm not trying to whatever. I don't want to make it seem like I disagree with the big guys, but I actually prefer my clients and my group members to train a little bit harder, maybe with a little bit less volume, and then maybe that's where I'm coming from here, where I actually believe that this is not such a bad strategy if you don't train with so much volume. So it depends how much volume you're training with. If there's like dog crap training or DC training, if you guys look into that, where it's really low volume but really high intensity. And so this is actually a strategy you would employ, that you would use. You would train with 0 to 1 RIR from the get-go, but you would acknowledge that there's an inverse relationship between how hard you train and how much you can train, how much volume you can do. So you'd be training with more intensity. You'd have to scale back the amount of sets, and that might net out to really good gains. If we want to talk about what would give us the optimal gains, this is a slightly different story, and I'd bet that training with 0 to 1 RIR on every set all the time, that probably would lose the argument for what is physiologically optimal, just because you wouldn't be able to net enough. You would net less stimulus, I believe, because you'd be training so fucking hard that you'd run into more issues of overreaching, overtraining than if you took one tiny step back. And that sort of stimulus to fatigue ratio in that 1 to 3 RIR is probably the best. It's probably the way for you to accumulate the most total tension, total quality tension, quote, volume. And so that conversation might be a little bit dense, but I actually don't disagree that training a little bit harder is a fine strategy from the get-go. We actually definitely do that in the group. We train on average with a 2 RIR. Sometimes we start at 0 to 1 right from the get-go on some movements. Sometimes we start beyond failure right from the get-go. But the harder we train, the more we acknowledge that the less sets we'll be able to do. Next question. I think I've been overdoing cardio and steps, but I'm nervous to slow down or stop. Help me. My first thoughts, and I don't want to breeze over this question. I don't even know how long I've been going now because I had that little technical difficulty here. Got a little second wind. I was speaking directly to the camera and to you when I say this, is acknowledge that you have to do this, right? That you must do this. So maybe you're nervous about how it's going to go. You don't want to gain weight. You don't want to decrease your activity and your calories burned and gain weight, but you must do this. And so start to get a little bit of like a mentality of acceptance that you have to do this, so that you can't do this amount of cardio forever. Like put that in your head of like, this is something I must do. It might be hard. There might be roadblocks. You might gain weight, right? That might happen. You might gain a little bit of weight doing this. You might fuck something up. I don't know. But you must do this. So start to wrap your head around the fact that you must embark on this journey of lowering steps down to a sustainable level. My advice to you is actually two things. One is a mentality of acceptance that you must do this. Number two is acknowledge that there's actually just like additions of like I'm going to be speaking in March about like volume for hypertrophy. And one of the key things that we're going to talk about is that there's a diminishing return with more volume. There's a diminishing return with more steps. You might be doing 20,000 steps a day right now, let's say. If you go down to 15,000 steps, you will not be burning 25% less calories, right? Because there's a diminishing return. I would bet somewhere around that, like 12,000 steps per day, 10 to 12. Actually, there's a diminishing return the whole time, but where we start to see like a big diminishing return, a big compensatory effect, tends to be when people go from moderately active to very active. So if you're sedentary and you go from sedentary to moderately active, there's a big calorie burn boost. It's an amazing thing. But when we see moderately active people become very active, they don't gain as many net calories burned. There's a bit of a compensatory effect. And so I would hang my hat on the fact that like if you went from 20,000 steps to 10,000 steps, much more sustainable. You wouldn't be burning 50% less calories, right? It would not be a net 50% decrease in calories burned, even though it's a decrease in steps by 50%. I don't know the exact amount, the exact percentage. There's too many moving parts here, but I would hang my hat a little bit on like, a lot of people are like, hey, Jordan, I got injured, or, it's cold out and I used to do 12,000 steps. Now I'm doing 8,000. How much should I decrease my calories? And sometimes I'm like, not at all. You might go down 4,000 steps. That might be a 33% decrease in steps. And you might find out that you don't need to change your calories at all because your body's an amazing, amazing machine. And there's some compensatory effect where maybe your subconscious movement kind of compensates for that decrease in intentional activity. And it ends up netting out to be totally fine. And so I might start by saying, hey, don't do it all at once. Don't slash your steps in half, but maybe cut it by 33% and don't change anything at all because you might be surprised that nothing is going to happen. I've had that experience with clients so many times where they're nervous about decreasing steps and nothing changes, right? That the body's just an amazing machine, that there is some compensatory mechanisms in there, especially for people who are going from really freaking active to like more moderately and sustainably active, that it ends up being like, you didn't actually need to change something at all this whole time. And you were all nervous about gaining a bunch of weight. You got to decrease your calories when in reality that didn't actually have to happen. And so that's definitely something I would consider. I think general advice to like maybe not slash it in half. Do you want to do it in a slow, meticulous manner where you're dropping it by a little bit? Or do you want to cold turkey it because you're just fucking sick of it? I think that there's merit to both of those strategies. If you wanted to pick more of a middle ground where let's say you were 20K and let's say you wanted to go to 10K where you're like, hey, I'm going to go to 15K and we're going to see how that goes. Like, I think that would be a fine strategy to kind of step down, do a meaningful chunk right out of the way so you can at least feel like you're actually starting to chip away at this goal here. But I wouldn't automatically assume that this is going to end in some sort of like, you can't get away from the fact that you're going to gain weight doing this. I'm not sure that is going to happen. You could also decrease calories a little bit. Again, I just spent a whole like fucking 10 minutes telling you that you probably don't have to, which I agree with, but you could be like, yeah, I'm going to decrease calories a tiny bit. Most people don't want to do this. That's the whole point you're asking the question, because you know that you could just eat less. You don't want to. It's part of the reason you're doing so much cardio in the first place is so that you could eat more probably, or you think you can eat more. And so, yeah, I think I would recommend considering a step-by-step manner of like a step down by a certain percentage, but I wouldn't change anything right off the bat. I would give yourself a little bit of time, 2 to 4 weeks, to see how does my hunger and body shape and size regulate to this new activity level. Because depending on what you were doing and depending on how much you'd like to do that you find sustainable, you might not need to change anything at all. So I would absolutely, if we were a one-on-one client, I'd want to know more of that. Question, would love your thoughts and opinions on the new AAP childhood obesity guidelines. So I have seen some snippets of these guidelines. I've seen people up in arms over these guidelines. I have not read the full text of these guidelines. And, I saw this question in here just a couple minutes before I was starting to hit record, and I pulled up the guidelines. So it's actually something I'm going to read today in full, because I don't think I want to give too many. I saw some people like, oh my God, they're considering bariatric surgery for children. This is so fucked up. I don't think that should be categorically off the table for children. I don't think that there's something inherently like that can absolutely not happen, that we can't ever do that with children. I think I saw a lot of that on social media. People like, they're recommending that all kids get bypass surgery or bariatric surgery, or they get a gastric sleeve. That I don't think that that's what this is. I will read the whole guidelines though. I would be very disappointed if there were no discussions of lifestyle variables. I'd be very surprised if that's the case. I don't think I could categorically rule out bariatric surgery for children, for pediatrics. I don't think I would know enough about this. Like, I think people who are like up in arms as if that's like the first line of defense. Yeah, I would be up in arms if that's the first line of defense too. I don't think that's the case though, but I don't want to comment too much. I'm going to read the full text. Maybe in my next Q&A, you can ask this question again and I can give some further thoughts. I think it's an incredibly important topic though, so I'm super glad you asked. And I was going to say normally I'd try and give some thoughts, but this isn't something I want to take a stab at without having a good handle on what those guidelines actually are. So ask again in the next check-in or the next Q&A. I'd love to give my further opinion. I have the full text. I read an article on it before, but even that I don't think does it justice. Every article has an agenda, and so I want to read the full text myself and get my own agenda. How many more questions? We got quite a bit here. Let's see. Do we really need to train 2 times a week if we can hit the same frequency or the same total volume, as I think you mean, in one session, assuming it's less than 10 sets? So let's say you're training with 10 sets per muscle group per week on average. Could you do that in a bro split in a 1 times per week frequency and get the same results? I absolutely think yes. I think 100% yes. You could train with a full-on back day and a full-on pec day and a leg day, and do it all in one session, and provided that your total volumes aren't so high that the per session volume, it's like, I like giving the studying example. Like, if you need to study 2 hours per week, can you do that in one session? Absolutely, right? If that's the amount of studying you need to do to accomplish the goal, you can do that in one session, right? Like, there's a general idea that, frequency would be beneficial. Well, frequency would be beneficial if the amount of work you have to do, you can't do in one shot, or you can't do optimally in one shot, or there's a big benefit to doing it in more than one shot. If we take that studying example, I think you can do 2 hours of really, really good studying. I think the quality drop off is not there in 2 hours. But if you need to study 10 hours per week to accomplish, the amount of studying that you would need to study, I think we can all agree that at some point in a single session, quality would drop off meaningfully, that splitting this up into multiple sessions would give you the highest quality return. And that's the same thing with volume. If you are doing, and I say if you are doing / if you need to do, how you would know that you would need to do this is a separate question. But let's say you're like, I got to do, 20 sets for my back. I think that at 20 sets per workout, I think you would start to see a diminished return in quality. So if your back needed 20 sets to grow, I wouldn't do all 20 in one session, because I think that that's that 10-hour per week studying circumstance where you would start to see a quality drop off beyond a certain point. And that's why you said, if assuming it's less than 10 sets. I think if you're studying for 2 hours a week, you can do it all in one session. If you're studying for 10 hours a week, I would break it up. And so if you're somebody who's like, I'm doing 20 sets a week for my back, again, I think having the discussion of whether or not you need that is a very important topic that I'm very passionate about. But let's assume that that's just like what you're doing. Yes, I think that there is such thing as a per session volume limit, where after that performance drops off, notably, that splitting it up would be more beneficial. Totally. If I was like trying to train my chest with 20 sets per week, I wouldn't do it all in one session. If I'm doing, 9 sets for my for the week, I would do them all in one session. I wouldn't bat an eyelash. I wouldn't expect worse results at all, actually. Next question. Does your program do strictly hypertrophy training? Do I ever throw in a strength cycle? Here's the problem with this. One, I don't want to jump down your throat here. It's a great question. The answer is no. As of right now, we only do hypertrophy cycles. We do not do strength training. We do not do metabolic training. We don't do circuit training. We don't do endurance training. We just do hypertrophy training. I am not in a place where I believe that deviations from hypertrophy will potentiate greater net hypertrophy. I don't believe that doing a strength cycle has meaningful hypertrophy benefits over the long term over just doing hypertrophy. So I don't believe that if your main goal is hypertrophy, I don't think that there's a physiological reason to ever not do hypertrophy. That's my current stance, for sure, I'd say. That is for sure what I believe is what I'm saying. Is that if your goal is hypertrophy and you have the opportunity to do a strength cycle or a hypertrophy cycle over the net years and years that you're training, I don't think that that strength cycle is having a net greater impact on hypertrophy gains than if you had just done hypertrophy during that time. So I can't really make a physiological argument as to why we would ever do a strength cycle. So physiologically speaking, the main goal is hypertrophy. So in order to do something that's not hypertrophy, strength training, you would have to argue that will produce greater net hypertrophy over X period of time than if you had just done hypertrophy. I don't believe that to be the case. Now, the other reason that you would do a strength cycle is for fun, is to change it up, is if you enjoy that. And I say for fun, and that's up for debate. So I don't believe it would be fun. Now it's not just about me, but I'm saying I'm an example of someone that wouldn't enjoy that. And so in a group setting, that can be quite polarizing, where like maybe 50% of people would enjoy the strength training, or let's say 33% of people would really enjoy it, 33% of people would be like, yeah, whatever, it's fine, and 33% of people would really, really hate it. And 33% of people really, really hating it is just a tough thing to do in a group. It's the same with like metabolic training, which is like endurance, which is like circuit training. It's like, I don't see a physiological advantage. And if I think 1/3 of my group is going to really hate it, then it's a really tough sell. Now, there's 33% of people that would really like the strength training cycle. And so I'm not giving those people the thing that they might really like, but they might be just fine not doing the strength. They might like the strength cycle, but they might be fine not doing it. And so my goal is to solve for net happiness and net enjoyment, right? And I'm using the word net because I'm accepting that to solve for net means that you can't make not everyone's going to love exactly what we're doing 100% all the time. And so my goal is to solve for net overall happiness for the most people. And I just can't think of a physiological reason to do strength training if the main goal is hypertrophy. And from a overall, like a large population standpoint, there's just too many people who wouldn't like that. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's an assumption I'm making. Maybe everybody would love it. I really would bet that that's not the case. My assumption is that if people join the group for hypertrophy, they want to do hypertrophy training, at least for the vast majority of the time. And if they join for hypertrophy and then I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but we're doing strength training, they would say, okay, well, tell me how this benefits my hypertrophy training. And I don't really have a good reason for that. I understand the theoretical reasons. I don't think that they actually are real, though. I can understand like what people might say about why a strength training would potentiate better hypertrophy. I don't believe that to be the case, though. So I'm not totally against it. If you find it fun, it's tough to do in a group setting without my belief that there's a physiological advantage and with the understanding that there'd be a large percentage of people that wouldn't enjoy it. So that's my stance on that. It might change in the future, who knows? Next question, thoughts on other coaches suggesting bulking is not ideal for women. So you and I had a chat about this. The person who is talking about this, somebody I respect a ton, that I really love, we could talk about it. Martin McDonald has a stance in a podcast that he was talking about where he's like basically saying that most women shouldn't bulk. And his stance, and I don't want to put words in his mouth because it's been a while since I've heard the full breadth of his argument here, is basically that women will have a harder time losing weight. And so actively getting fatter will be not as fun for women because of how they distribute fat and the fact that it will be generally a little bit more difficult for women. Now, the thing is, while Martin is making a lot of these arguments, I know why you're asking. We had this chat and I've listened to the podcast. And while he's making these arguments, I'm disagreeing with him along the way. I'm like, yeah, I'm not really sure I'm not really sure I agree with that. And that happened multiple times in the podcast. And then he went on to explain what he meant by bulking. And, a lot of the things that I was disagreeing with along the way, I was like, you know what though? Like, I disagree. I think women can bulk slowly. They don't need to gain a ton of fat. They can go into a very small surplus because that's what you should do when you're bulking. That you should go into a very small surplus and you should gain weight very slowly. And you shouldn't get to a point where you're at a body fat level that it negatively impacts your health. And so that was my idea of bulking. So as he was talking about, hey, you shouldn't do this, maybe you shouldn't do that, like I was like, I think it would be fine because I think this is what I mean by bulking. Then he went on to say, you know what, I don't think women should be gaining a ton of body fat. I don't think that they should be pushing their body fat super high and gaining a lot of being in like some big bulk. And then I caught myself agreeing with him because if that's your definition of bulking, where you're doing a dirty bulk, you're gaining weight super fast, you're gaining a ton of body fat over the course of the bulk, and then it might be harder to lose. Yeah, I agree with that. And so I think there was a little bit of a difference in definition of bulking. I would not recommend doing that sort of a bulk. I would recommend bulking incredibly slowly, if at all. A 5 to 10% calorie surplus where you're gaining roughly 1% of your body weight per month or less. And I think that doing it that way, I think it totally is fine for everybody. Like, I don't think that there's a female specific consideration, in my opinion. There's only a strategic consideration of not bulking super duper fast, gaining a lot of body fat very quickly. Now, I want to talk about a different question. The question is, does anybody need to bulk ever at all? And I'm going to say a sentence here. I believe that everybody, every single person, bar, hypertrophy non-responders, which are like literally probably close to nobody, but there's probably more than 0% of people that have an issue with gaining muscle. But let's say the 99.99999% of people can get fit. And these are all subjective words. Fit, what does that mean? Healthy, what does that mean? Look muscular, what does that mean? But I'm going to just take a leap and take a generalized approach to those definitions. I believe that everybody can get fit, strong, healthy, look fit, look muscular, look like they lift, have muscle definition, have muscles without ever spending one day in a surplus. And what I mean by that is that I believe everybody can look all of those things, fit, strong, healthy, muscular, by just lifting at maintenance or a deficit if your goal is to lose fat at some point. If people want more than that, the amount of muscle you can gain, right? Until you reach a point where you gain muscle at maintenance so freaking slowly that gaining muscle at maintenance is no longer practical. That person, if you've gained so much muscle that gaining muscle at maintenance is no longer practical, and you've done that all at maintenance calories, all right? You've never spent any time in a surplus. I believe that you will be fit and muscular and strong and have muscles. I want to see if I can rephrase this better. Most people who have been lifting at maintenance, they were newbies. They didn't do a surplus. They just started lifting. That's it. If you do that for 5 years, you're going to be pretty darn muscular and fit and strong. If you want more than that, yeah, maybe a surplus is what you have to do. But most people don't need to be bodybuilders. Most people don't need to be, 90% of their genetic potential. They need to hit an FFMI of, north of 25 or whatever. Like most people, to get fit and strong and healthy, you don't need to ever spend one day in a surplus, ever. The amount of muscle that you can build as a newbie at maintenance or a deficit, depending on if during that time you also want to lose some fat, is a lot of muscle. Like the vast majority of your genetic potential, I believe you can build without going into a surplus. I say vast majority, a very high percentage, a percentage that I believe for most people you could accrue without ever spending any time in a surplus. Will some people get to a point where they are impatient and they'd like it to go faster and so they want a surplus? Yeah, that's totally fine. But I believe if you lifted for 5 or 10 years for hypertrophy with good recovery habits, enough protein and maintenance calories, or spending some time in a deficit if you want to lose some fat, that you will arrive at a physique that is fit and strong and healthy and muscular that you would generally, most people, be happy with without ever going into a surplus. That has nothing to do with whether or not you could go into a surplus to speed things up, or if at that point or at any point you want more than that. Totally open. I believe everybody can do that. Go ahead. If you're going to do that, do it slow, 5 to 10% over maintenance calories. That's roughly like 100 to 300 calories for most people. Aim to gain roughly 1% of your body weight per month, maybe even a little bit less is cool. You can do it for longer if it's slower. But yeah, I'm not in full agreement with that stance. If we're talking about a slow deficit, if we're talking about super dirty bulk, gain a ton of body fat really quickly, yeah, I don't think anybody should do that, by the way. If reps are staying the same for multiple weeks on a body weight exercise, but it's to failure, am I still growing muscle? Yes, you are. In the short to medium term, you are. In the long term, if you check back with me in 2 years from now and you can't do any more reps or weight, then I can't be sure that you've built muscle. But in the short to medium term, I believe yes. I believe you can at least assume yes. But if this happens forever, like let's extrapolate this. If you're like, hey, Jordan, 5 years ago, I'm doing the same weight and reps as I did 5 years ago, and I've been doing it the same week every week for the last 5 years, I can't be sure that you've grown, for sure. But if you're like, hey, Jordan, for the last 3 weeks, I've been training super hard, but I've just really been struggling to add reps and load, I would say, okay, that's cool. I would not be sure that you haven't grown. I would bet that you have grown, or you have sent a hypertrophic stimulus. You have gotten a good stimulative benefit from that. I would start to look at the overall programming a little bit. I'd want to look at form videos. I'd want to talk about calories. I'd want to talk about sleep. I would want to talk about things that might kind of set off a signal in my brain of like, let's check on these things to make sure that you aren't going to keep doing this for the next 5 years and never progress. But I would say that in the short to medium term, it's the hard training that grows muscle. Over 5 years, yeah, you should absolutely be able to do more reps and load if you want to be sure that you've been growing. So I wouldn't worry about this in weeks. I would worry about it from like mesocycle to mesocycle to mesocycle to mesocycle over a 6 month to 3 year period. Definitely, I would think about this. I also think that when people are like, quote, struggling to progress, I also think that they're not taking into account a lot of other variables, like smaller opportunities to progress. They're like, I can't progress because every time I put on 25 pounds, it's too heavy. I'm like, yeah, well, what about 2.5 pounds? What about one more rep on one set? Right? What about slight improvements in technique that eventually can lead you to making some of those load and rep progressions? So a lot of times I think people are not necessarily as in tune with the fact that progressions should be super duper mega small, or more appropriately, like will be very likely super duper mega small. Cool. Next question. What's your stand on the quote, metabolism doesn't change with age, we just move less? I think that it is factually true that metabolism, your like base metabolic rate, doesn't decrease between age 20 to 60. I do believe that we move less. And that's why it's so important to like have some form of movement quantification to count your steps or minutes done doing cardio or number of walks per week or something. I struggle with this one because I know the reason you're asking. The reason you're asking is that anecdotally, it gets harder to lose weight when you get older, even for clients who are tracking their movement and who are moving quite a bit. And so the question is, well, if I'm moving a lot and it's harder now, I must have some other independent variable that is decreasing. And that would assume to be my BMR, let's say, my base metabolic rate, my metabolism. It's hard to argue based on current research that there is something else going on, because we have really good research across the population from age 20 to 60 that metabolism base metabolic rate stays pretty static. Basically static. And so it's hard to say. I'm not sure. What I would say, okay, so how does this affect my coaching? If a client's struggling in their 40s and 50s and they're like, you know what, this was easier in my 20s and 30s, and they're still doing things really great, they're getting 10,000 steps, their nutrition's on point, and they can't figure out why this is harder, I'm gonna be compassionate. I'm not gonna jump down their throat and be like, no, that's fucking bullshit. Your metabolism doesn't slow down. You're doing something wrong. You're just not moving enough. Like, I'm gonna be compassionate to the fact that there might be variables that are a little bit less tangible that we might not be able to perfectly account for. And so I would be passionate or compassionate towards these circumstances, but I would want to empower those clients to know that they're not the victim of a big sweeping shift in metabolism that makes this sort of thing not practical and not plausible for them. And so it is a careful balance between playing the victim and enabling your client to feel like a victim while being compassionate that maybe there are some unforeseen variables here. I mean, growing older in different stages of life brings on a ton of variables that are almost unquantifiable, incredibly not tangible. So I would be compassionate towards those, recognize that there might be some things that make this harder that we can't perfectly see in the literature. But at the same time, we have really good literature that says the metabolism's not slowing down between 20 and 60. And so let's at least take off the idea that there's like big grand sweeping change. Oh, once I hit 40, my metabolism tanked. It's like that certainly did not happen. And so it is like everything in this like fitness or the discussion of body fatness and obesity, it's like we want to dance between the line of personal responsibility and acknowledgement of physiology, that there are genetic variables and there's things physiologically that change over the lifespan, but we also don't want to totally enable our clients to play the victim and never take any responsibility for the power that they do have to make changes. So that's my current stance here. It is one of acknowledging that metabolism probably doesn't slow very much, but also being compassionate that there might be other things that we can't see, and just taking that into my coaching, into the way, my rhetoric, the way I would be discussing this with the client. I'm gonna go all the way through it. Fuck it, we're gonna do it. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more. Shit, let's see. I think some of these will be a little quicker. Best moves to grow glutes but not hamstrings. Been doing hip thrusts and step ups, etc., but hamstrings grow. My knee jerk, I promise, everything I say is I'm never trying to be a dick. If I'm a little bit direct sometimes, it's just because I'm going to let you in on like what my knee jerk reactions are, and then we'll talk about it. My knee jerk reactions is like, how do you know your hamstrings are growing? Like how do you even know that? Like, I chuckle to that where I'm like, progress is so fucking slow. How do you know your hamstrings are growing? Like, that's my first thought, is like, are you like measuring your hamstrings? Like, you've seen meaningful hamstring growth? I've been lifting for like 10 years. I don't think I've ever like seen meaningful hamstring growth. It's just like a muscle that you don't typically tend to see. Like, you don't look at it very often, right? It's not like something, it's like, oh, look at my bicep. Like, that is like more tangible, or like my pecs or my back, or like or my glutes. Like, even like hamstrings, like probably the hardest muscle to actually sense that you're growing in. It's like probably the muscle you see the least. So I'd be like curious, like, are you letting your fears of hamstring growth like kind of like create a thought in your mind that they are growing? Like, is that manifesting into them you thinking they grow? Hip thrusts and step ups do not meaningfully work the hamstrings. Like, that's period, end of story. You are doing movements with a very bent knee. When you bend the knee, you shorten the hamstring. And so step ups and glute bridges and leg presses and squats and lunges and split squats and all of these things, they do not meaningfully grow your hamstrings. They might give you a tiny bit of stimulus sometimes. You know, people go, oh, if your feet are too far away from you in a hip thrust, then it'll work your hamstrings. That's true. If your feet are further away from you, your hamstrings will work a little bit, but they still won't work a lot. They still will not work a lot. And I say they won't work a lot, meaning I don't think that they'll grow very much at all. Certainly not with these movements. So if you wanted to grow your glutes without growing your hamstrings, you would do what you're already doing, which is why I'm skeptical that they've grown, which is why I'm curious how you know they've grown. Like, all lower body pressing movements that have a very bent knee, split squats, squat patterns, leg presses, step ups, again, glute bridges have a very bent knee, should be a 90-degree knee angle. What that does is that disadvantages the hamstrings, which just means you're already doing all the things you can do to not grow your hamstrings. So that's why I'm skeptical that they've grown at all, or how you've been assessing that they grow, because, you know, don't do RDLs, don't do seated hamstring curls, don't do the lying hamstring curls. But the two that you mentioned don't grow the hamstring meaningfully at all. So that's the only reason I'm coming at it from that perspective. So I would look more at your actual hamstring training, like RDLs, seated ham curls, lying ham curls. In a cut, next question. In a cut, will you see the same results hitting each macro versus hitting calories in total calories method? Yes, you will. You will. Outside of very extreme examples where, like, if you just counted calories and protein, that you'd go keto. P.S. You'd lose the same amount of fat in keto. You just lose more water weight. And so, yes. The answer is yes. I don't want to go deep into the extreme scenarios where I believe there might be a difference, because I don't believe people will go to an extreme macro split if they just count calories and protein. What I'm saying is, if you just count calories and protein, the extreme outcome of that is that you only eat fat and you never ate carbs, right? And you went keto. You intuitively went keto. And I'm already like, I already don't want to go down this route because nobody intuitively goes keto. But yeah, I think there'd be a difference between a very high carb, low fat. Yeah, I actually don't even think there'd be a difference. I really don't think there'd be a difference. I don't even know if I could make an example where I think there'd be a difference. Maybe there's some super nuance of like, yeah, with more carbs, maybe I train harder and I build more muscle. But even that, I think, would take a very long time to manifest. And you'd have to be pretty trained for, I think, that difference to actually manifest in something that you would see. And even with all of that, I think the sustainability benefits of counting calories and protein, like, by 100-fold outweigh these physiological potential differences, which I think, again, are most arguably none. Next question. Wait, did you get an opossum? Where have I been? I did not get an opossum, but one of my lovely group members, at the end of our group Zooms, what I like to do is, everybody who's on the Zoom, I tell people, can you please, I say, show me your pet. And it's just a really nice thing where everybody turns on their camera if they had their camera off, and they like hold up their pet or they come show me their pet. And it's just a really nice moment where everyone shows their dog or, their cat or whatever. And it's really great because I love pets. I love animals. It's just super fun. And one of my clients showed us her opossum, her pet opossum. And it was like I literally just stopped the Zoom. I put her on like the massive screen and I said, you need to tell us about this. And so if you haven't listened, it was our this latest Zoom. And so you can go back and watch the recordings. They're all saved. Just scroll to the end if you want. And Brenna, shout out, showed us her pet opossum and then sent a bunch of text to the group chat of like baby pictures. And it's literally it is the most adorable thing. It's like it's like doing like a trapeze climb, like it was climbing on like trees and stuff, but like it goes upside down and it's like basically on like people's like cell phone wires because it's like as big as like your hand. Is the most adorable thing ever. I did not get an opossum though, but I wouldn't put it past Jenna. Next question. Peptides, are they a scam? Kindly, I have no fucking clue. I'm so ignorant to things like steroids and SARMs and peptides. I have no clue. To me, they scare the shit out of me. The thing with this sort of stuff is that I just told you can get fit, strong, and healthy without a surplus. You can get fit and strong and healthy and muscular and live an amazingly strong, robust physical life without steroids and peptides and SARMs and any of these things. So to me, I just never even been interested in it at all. That's probably not true. When I was 20, I was probably like interested in, should I take these to get even more mega jacked? But like, you just don't need them to have amazing results. So cool. Next question, sub for RDL for homebodies that is not hinging. I'm dealing with a sciatica flare-up. So I not chuckle at this question, but like a lot of times people are like, hey Jordan, what's a sub for this? Because this is hurting or something like that. And so if you want to sub for an RDL, the subs I'm going to give you are things that are like an RDL. They're good mornings. They're B-stance RDLs. They're basically other hinge movements, maybe 45-degree hip extensions. And so when a lot of people ask for subs, the best answer is a like for like sub. And if someone's like, hey, I can't do the leg press, because I can't get into that much, whatever. Let's use this example. If I can't do an RDL, what's a like for like swap? What is a swap? So do you want a like for like swap? Because that's probably going to give you the same discomfort. And so when someone's like, hey, I'd like a not like for like swap, or somebody like, hey, what's a swap I can do for the pull-ups? I don't want to grow this muscle. And it's like, okay, so what you're asking is a different exercise for a different muscle. You're not asking for a swap. And so if you're like, hey, what's a sub for RDLs that's not hinging? Yeah, the best answer is, well, okay, if you don't want the absolute most like for like movement pattern, then maybe you want a like for like muscle group, and that would be something like a seated hamstring curl or a lying hamstring curl. But maybe that gives you pain, or maybe you're someone who's asking because you don't want to grow your hamstrings. So I'm always, it's helpful that you gave me context as to why you want the swap. Sometimes people are like, oh, I want to swap for this. I'm like, okay, but the swap for that is going to be something very like that. Do you want something very like that or something not like that might work similar muscles, or you just want to swap to something freaking different? So my advice to you is a good morning would be the like for like swap, but it's also a hinge. You probably get the same pain. If you want to work the hamstrings, a seated hamstring curl or a lying hamstring curl, if you're doing one of those and you have the opportunity to do both, I would do both. If you don't have the opportunity to do both and you're already doing one of them, you're kind of shit out of luck in terms of training the hamstring. You could do a 45-degree hip extension, but we're also doing that already. And so maybe you would just want to pick a different leg movement for different leg muscles that you would also be interested in doing. And so hopefully that's helpful. I'm sorry you're having pain. And I'm glad you added context as to why you want the swap, because it does help me. Because, I wouldn't give, if you're like, hey, what's a swap for the RDL? I might say good morning, but I'm guessing that would give you discomfort. So in an attempt to still work similar muscle groups, you could do a seated hamstring curl potentially. Next question. We've got 3 more. Let's do it. For hypertrophy, does 3 sets of 6 equal 3 sets of 10 with the same RIR? Yes, it does. If you do sets between, some people are going to say sets between 5 and 30, if they are taken equally close to failure, give you equal hypertrophy. I might not go, hold on. I might not go as far as to use such absolute language. I might not use the whole range of 5 to 30, and I might not say it gives you exactly the same hypertrophy. I would say maybe in the 6 to 15 rep range, you're going to get basically exactly the same hypertrophy if RIR is equated. North of 15, we might start to looking at over the long-term differences. I believe maybe less hypertrophy, maybe, but I could be wrong, could be equal. But you said 6 and you said 10, and I don't think there's any difference, totally. Next question, full body 5 days. How do I know how many sets I need, or I know how many sets I need, but don't know how to distribute them? Luckily for you, the distribution of volume across the week is a very low priority for gains. So I would distribute them in an attempt, here's the first thing I would do, in an attempt to make all of the days equally hard, if that is what matches with your schedule. Sometimes people have schedules where it's probably better for them to have some days that are easier and some days that are harder. Maybe, you want to save one of your harder days for the weekend and you want to have easier days, on a day that you have to work after work or work out after work or something. But I would start by trying to make the days equally difficult from a systemic perspective. So I can't give you more advice than this because it's a long conversation we're not going to go into, but the short version is split up the exercises in a way where the days are all equally difficult. Don't put RDL, back squat, Bulgarian split squat, walking lunge all on one day and leg extension, leg curl, calf raise, adductor machine on another day. Now you could do that, by the way, if, like I said, you had days that needed to be easier. My first go at this though would be to make the days roughly similar from a systemic perspective. Don't put bicep curl, tricep curl, lateral raise, calf raise on one day and barbell bench press, barbell row, barbell overhead press, all of these crazy bilateral heavier upper body movements. I would start to pick maybe 1 or 2 systemically taxing compounds and then look at some less systemically taxing isolation lifts and start to build the days like that. Again, if you want them to be roughly equally systemically fatiguing, that would be my first stab at that. Next question, how to not gain fat after a long cut of 3 months. There's a what answer to this question and a how question. The what question is to not go into a calorie surplus, is to not eat so much. If you're gaining weight, if you're gaining a bunch of weight, you're eating too much / not moving enough. And so I don't want to be a dick with that sort of direct answer here, but dude, if you're gaining weight, if you're not a little bit of weight, by the way, when you end your cut, I would not suspect that you're going to maintain every single pound that you've lost because not every single pound that you've lost was fat. So a lot of it was muscle glycogen and water that comes with that, stomach content that comes from eating less calories, eating less overall food. And so I suspect that you'll gain some weight because some of even if you do this perfectly, you're going to gain some weight because some of the weight you lost wasn't fat. It was water weight through a number of different channels, and you're probably going to gain that weight back. So I wouldn't suspect to keep all your weight off. But if you're gaining fat, because you use the word fat, week after week after week after week, and the weight is trending up, I don't want to be a dick, but eat less or move more. You're in a surplus, get out of a surplus. That's the what. The how. How do you go about that? How do you find your new maintenance? How do you know when it's a surplus and it's not just some of this glycogen restoration and water retention and normal non-fat weight that you'd gain after a cut? That's a longer discussion that you would want to have with a coach. I think if you're gaining fat, if you can declare that, hey, it's been months and I'm gaining weight, then you're in a surplus and that you need to address that. You need to either eat less or move more, or accept that maybe trying to maintain here's where it gets complicated. Maybe trying to maintain the weight that you were when you ended the cut wasn't sustainable for you. Maybe that doesn't really match up with your natural genetic hunger and satiety signaling. Your body fat set point. Maybe you are not going to be able to live comfortably at that body weight. That's possible. And so there's a big discussion here of it starts with, you're in a surplus, dude. Eat less or move more. You're in a surplus. Get out of a surplus. Then there's the how side of the question of, how do you know, right? How do you know that you've gone into a surplus? It's not just non-fat weight regain. How do you go about sustaining eating less or moving more, right? How do you arrange your lifestyle variables and your behaviors to maintain lower calorie range or greater movement, on average? Those are important questions too. But they're questions you should have with a coach, that you should, look at your life and your habits and your behaviors, your genetics, your environment, your beliefs, your headspace. This is where coaching becomes coaching, actually looking at the individual, looking at your biofeedback. How do you feel? How did you feel at the end of the cut? How do you feel 5 pounds heavier? How do you feel 10 pounds heavier? Presumably with more calories at each of those stages. You know, your leanest self won't be your most comfortable life. Like I've been 225 pounds, I've been 175 pounds. And I know that even if I'm at maintenance calories at both of those body weights, 225, 175, 50 pound difference, that there's a big difference in how I feel, even though I think I'm at maintenance calories. And if you want to listen to more about set point, I know that that's a fringe discussion. The beginning discussion is you're in a surplus. What do we want to do about that? But I do think that there's a discussion here of like, assuming you're going to be able to just, because you're at maintenance calories, feel great, never be hungry, and just maintain all your fat loss at every body weight, at every body size and body fatness is not the case. Not all of us can maintain the same level of leanness with the same amount of comfort based on our genetic hunger and satiety signaling. Cool, super long Q&A. We had a little break in there, so I caught a second win there. And so I appreciate you guys listening. Thank you for everybody who asked a question, and I'll see you guys in the next one.